FK off. Feng Wu Dao stood on the spot without moving like a mountain when facing the gray-clothed middle-aged man that approached menacingly, and the corners of his mouth moved slightly as he spat out two words unhurriedly. At the same time, a terrifying force that caused even the air to tremble instantly swept out with the raise of his hand, and it seemed as if it was assisted by the gods as it fearlessly moved to intercept the gray-clothed middle-aged man. Bang! Subsequently, an enormous bang sounded out, yet an enormous force instantly obliterated the gray-clothed middle-aged man's attack that swept over, and the attack that was like 9 layers of waves was completely obliterated. The two of them were completely not on the same level. Not only that, the gray-clothed middle-aged man approached swiftly, yet left even more swiftly. He was blasted flying with a casual raise of Feng Wu Dao's hand and flew out over 10 meters, like an arrow that left the bow, before crashing onto the ground. After the gray-clothed middle-aged man fell to the ground, he bled from all 7 apertures as his body trembled for a while without any reason, and then he was completely without any signs of life. He was utterly dead. Whoosh! On the other side, the energy of heaven and earth that had just roiled in the sky above Feng Wu Dao instantly vanished without a trace. The speed Feng Wu Dao attacked at was obvious from this, and it was fast to the point that even the energy of heaven and earth didn't have enough time to react. Duan Ling Tian glanced indifferently at the middle-aged man's corpse, as he'd known the man was dead without a doubt since the moment the middle-aged man attacked them. Especially when the middle-aged man actually dared disrespect Tian Wu. That action had undoubtedly sped up the speed of his death. Let's go. Under Feng Wu Dao's lead, Duan Ling Tian and Feng Tian Wu followed closely to head forward all along the way. Everywhere they passed, all the people on the streets moved aside. These people had seen the scene that occurred earlier, the scene of a third-level void interpretation stage martial artist being killed instantly. These 3 people weren't people that they could offend. Tian Wu, you and Uncle Feng have come to the capital of Darming Dynasty in the past. When Duan Ling Tian noticed Feng Wu Dao moved familiarly to finally enter into an inn, he couldn't help but ask Feng Tian Wu curiously. Yes. Feng Tian Wu nodded. I've come here twice with my father, this is the 3rd time. Duan Ling Tian came to a sudden understanding. In next to no time, Feng Wu Dao got 3 rooms, 1 for each of them. After notifying Feng Wu Dao and Feng Tian Wu, Duan Ling Tian returned to his room and washed up, washing away the fatigue from his journey, and then he opened up the window in the room. Outside the window was the inn's inner courtyard, and it was an idyllic scene of birds and flowers that caused one to be unable to help but become calm. At the same time, the setting sun that descended gradually was reflected within Duan Ling Tian's eyes. Duan Ling Tian's gaze gradually became slightly dazed. Unknowingly, it has already been over 10 years since I came to this world. When I think back to it now, time really does bring about change, and it feels as if everything has changed so quickly. Duan Ling Tian sighed. In his previous life, he could be said to be an emotionless machine of slaughter, whereas, in this lifetime, he possesses too many people he was concerned about. Besides that, he was similarly filled with curiosity towards this world, and at the same time he was filled with curiosity, he also wanted to possess strength that couldn't be compared by another so that he could look down onto the universe and reign supreme. Only at that time would he be able to truly protect every single person that was by his side. If it was said that his target in the past was to become a martial emperor and become the strongest person on Cloud Continent, then he had a new target now. Even if he became a martial emperor, he still wanted to search through the mysterious world beyond the sea, as he wanted to know what exactly was there within the boundless sea. After all, even if it was the Rebirth Martial Emperor who was once the strongest expert on Cloud Continent, he didn't dare enter deep into those areas to search it. He would carry out what the Rebirth Martial Emperor did not dare do. In this way, his arrival and journey in this world wouldn't be in vain. The pressing matter at hand is to become eminent in the martial competition of the 10 dynasties. Only by revealing my worth will those powers of the foreign lands pay attention to me and allow me to join them. Duan Ling Tian's eyes flashed as bright lights flickered within. Besides the great treasure left behind by the Rebirth Martial Emperor, the next thing I must do is find Ker and Little Fei. After being separated for years, Duan Ling Tian missed his 2 fiancées even more deeply. When he returned the last time, he'd already found out from Qin Xiang about the whereabouts of those 2 fiancées of his. No matter if it was Ker or Little Fei, both of them were in a formidable sect in the foreign lands. That sect possessed a strength and influence that was unimaginable. So long as that sect was willing, even a powerhouse like the Darkhan dynasty's imperial family would be annihilated in an instant. The setting sun finally vanished and the veil of night started to descend. That night, Duan Ling Tian didn't comprehend any concepts, but instead lay on his bed and instead had a long and comfortable nap. This nap continued all the way until noon the next day before he finally awoke. Satisfying. After he woke up, Duan Ling Tian stretched his limbs and felt refreshed. It's been so long since I had such satisfying sleep. Duan Ling Tian pushed open his room's door and walked out after he washed up and changed his clothes, and he'd only just walked out of his room when he saw Feng Tianwu walking over towards him. "Big brother Duan, I was just about to go call you." "It's time to eat," said Feng Tianwu to Duan Ling Tian. Feng Wu Dao's room had a table filled with dishes, and they were still giving out steam. Obviously, they'd been served not long ago. Duan Lingtian's appetite couldn't help but be aroused when he saw this table full of delicacies. Even though he was already capable of achieving inertia to a certain degree with his current cultivation, and he wouldn't feel anything even if he didn't eat for a long time. But when facing these delicacies, he was still unable to control himself. "Looks like you had a nice sleep." Feng Wu Dao greeted Duan Lingtian. "Sit down and eat first. We won't be staying in the capital of Darming Dynasty for long. Let Tianwu take you to go have a look at the Ice Flame Pavilion after food, and you can properly experience the elegance of the #1 restaurant in the Darming Dynasty." Ice Flame Pavilion? Duan Lingtian's gaze flashed. Even though he'd only heard of the Ice Flame Pavilion for the first time, since this Ice Flame Pavilion was capable of being called the #1 restaurant in the Darming Dynasty, then it would presumably have something special about it. After all, even if it was the Darkhan Dynasty, he'd never heard of a #1 restaurant in the Darkhan Dynasty, because there wasn't a single restaurant that dared claim to be #1. The first wasn't something that anyone could claim to be, and if one didn't have the ability, then one would only be asking for insult. After they finished eating, Duan Lingtian and Feng Tianwu walked out of the inn. Duan Lingtian couldn't help but ask curiously once they'd just left the inn. "Tianwu, on what basis does that Ice Flame Pavilion call itself the #1 restaurant in the Darming Dynasty?" "Big Brother Duan, the name of #1 restaurant in the Darming Dynasty isn't a name that the Ice Flame Pavilion proclaimed by itself. It's instead publicly acknowledged by everyone in the Darming Dynasty." Feng Tianwu smiled. "Publicly acknowledged?" Duan Lingtian frowned and was still slightly unable to wrap his head around it. Could it be that there's something special about that Ice Flame Pavilion that causes everyone in the Darming Dynasty to publicly acknowledge it? This was something that was extremely difficult for Duan Lingtian to imagine. If it was a martial artist, then it wasn't strange for the person to be called #1 if he possessed a shocking strength, but wasn't a restaurant only a place to eat and drink? On what basis did it make the entire Darming Dynasty publicly acknowledge it as the #1 restaurant? "Big Brother Duan, you'll know why it's publicly acknowledged as the #1 restaurant in the Darming Dynasty after you've been there." Feng Tianwu smiled. "All those years ago when I and my father arrived at the Darming Dynasty's capital for the first time, we'd once felt amazed by this. Yet we understood after we went there once, and we felt the Ice Flame Pavilion deserved the name of #1 restaurant in the Darming Dynasty." Duan Lingtian laughed bitterly as Feng Tianwu had actually kept him guessing at the critical moment. But he felt more and more curious towards the Ice Flame Pavilion. Big brother Duan, over here. Under Feng Tianwu's lead, Duan Ling Tian moved through numerous spacious streets in the capital of Darming Dynasty, and he seemed to have transformed into a fish that had returned to the water and was swimming forward freely. All along the way, Duan Ling Tian saw many battles, and death couldn't be avoided in battles. At this moment, Duan Ling Tian once again clearly experienced the formidableness and prevalence of cultivating in the Darming dynasty, and it was indeed something the Darkhan dynasty couldn't compare to. Of course, the capital of the Darming dynasty possessed patrolling city guards that maintained order, yet their numbers were limited, after all, and they were utterly unable to manage the numerous battles that occurred all around the capital at the same time. Every time they headed over after obtaining the news, the person that had fought would have either fled or ran off to another place to look for someone else to battle. After half an hour, Feng Tianwu's figure stopped, whereas Duan Ling Tian stopped along with her. At the same time, Duan Ling Tian raised his eyes to look over. With a single glance, he saw a restaurant that stood towering before his eyes, or more precisely speaking, this was a restaurant in the shape of a tower. This restaurant occupied a vast area, and even though the area it occupied grew smaller as it went up, even the highest floor was probably easily capable of accommodating over 100 people. In next to no time, Duan Ling Tian saw a conspicuous and large plaque with golden words on this tower-shaped restaurant, and there were words written exquisitely atop it: Ice Flame Pavilion. When he saw these words, Duan Ling Tian knew that they'd arrived at their destination. There's even a restaurant like this. After he returned to his senses, Duan Ling Tian's gaze couldn't help but flash. Even if it's the imperial palace in the capital of the Darming dynasty, it probably doesn't have a palace that's higher than this. A restaurant with 9 floors, this is too exaggerated. In his previous life, buildings with 9 floors were everywhere, and they weren't rarely seen. Yet after arriving at this world that was similar to the ancient times in his previous life, Duan Ling Tian had never seen a pavilion that was more than 5 floors high, and the Ice Flame Pavilion before him was the tallest building he'd seen since coming to this world. Tianwu, I admit now that this restaurant is indeed capable of being called the #1 restaurant in the Darming dynasty based on the height of this pavilion. Duan Ling Tian said to Feng Tianwu, but the ranking of a restaurant ought to not be based on its height, right? Big brother Duan, I think you're mistaken. Feng Tianwu shook her head and smiled. The reason this Ice Flame Pavilion is called the #1 restaurant in the Darming dynasty isn't because of its enormous tower-shaped building that possesses 9 floors. Duan Ling Tian came to an understanding when he heard this, and then he smiled. Is that so? Then I'm more and more curious about it.